No engines, no flag, no name on any map. Just steel rising out of international water. They call it a platform. Insiders call it something else. A country built to answer to no one. For the ultra-wealthy, the modern nation-state has become a liability. Taxes they can't shelter, regulations they can't buy out of, cities they can no longer control, and rules they can't rewrite. So a small circle of billionaires stopped lobbying the system and started building an exit from it. Officially, it's classified as a marine research and residency platform. Unofficially, insiders have a different word for it: sovereign. Every wire, every legal filing, every recruitment contract points to one goal: independence from every government on Earth. The location was chosen with surgical precision, just outside the reach of any Coast Guard, any tax authority, any court, a gap in the map the world forgot to close. And they found it first. $100 billion, a price tag with no country's approval. No parliament voted on it, no treaty was signed. It is, by every legal definition available, impossible. And it is already 3 years under construction. The filing exploited a real, if obscure, legal mechanism. A small island nation, in exchange for a reported annual payment, agreed to flag New Meridian as a semi-autonomous protectorate. It is the same loophole cargo ships have used for decades to avoid labor and safety law, until a small circle decided cost was no longer the obstacle. Security arrived before residents did. A private maritime security contractor, composite name Trident Protective Group, was hired to patrol the waters. Its guards carry weapons but answer to no navy, no police force, no elected official. They answer only to the founder's circle. A leaked clause in Trident's contract authorizes proportional force to protect sovereign assets. No international body reviewed that clause. No court can challenge it. In effect, New Meridian had built an army before it had a single civilian resident. The order of operations told its own story. With the legal shield in place, New Meridian began selling its future to a select few. Residency contracts were pitched not as real estate, but as citizenship. Only individuals with a minimum net worth threshold, reportedly $50 million, were invited to apply. For the first time, sovereignty itself had a price tag. Applicants were screened more rigorously than most immigration systems on Earth. Financial background checks, reputation audits, interviews with a private admissions board. Far enough from any coastline that no nation could credibly claim it. New Meridian wasn't just exclusive, it was engineered to be. 3 years after the first column touched water, New Meridian held its founding ceremony. No reporters, no heads of state, no public announcement. Just 6 people, a private toast, and a document establishing a government. The most consequential nation-building event of the decade happened in total secrecy. The charter was signed, sealed, and quietly filed in 3 separate jurisdictions. No single government holds a complete copy. By design, no single court could ever compel its release. This place intended to redraw the line. The first 60 residents arrived by private ferry on a Tuesday morning. Investors appear only as numbered entities: Founder 1, Founder 2, Founder 6. Composite reporting from people close to the deal puts early contributions above $4 billion each. Nobody signed their real name to anything. For the first time, someone woke up in a country that answered to no flag but its own. New Meridian was no longer a plan. It was inhabited. The nearest coastal government finally responded, not with recognition, but with alarm. A formal statement called New Meridian a legal fiction with no basis in international law. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, demanding answers about the floating billionaires. Streets, plazas, foundations for towers that didn't exist yet. Workers who had been told they were building a research station started asking questions. For the first time, a warship changed course toward the platform. At the center of New Meridian stands a man composite sources call Dorian Cross. Inside New Meridian, the approaching warship registered instantly. Composite accounts describe the security team moving to a heightened alert posture within minutes. The Founder Circle was briefed by video within the hour. For the first time, the city built to escape nation-states had to decide how to face one. New Meridian's legal team responded within hours, not with silence, but with paperwork. An emergency filing invoked the flagging agreement with its sponsoring island nation. If the claim held, approaching New Meridian's waters would be an act against a sovereign state. It was a legal argument nobody had ever been forced to test in open water. It describes 3 branches: the Founders Circle, a resident council with limited power, and a security directorate answerable only to the founders. No court of appeal exists outside the platform itself. On paper, it is the most concentrated form of governance built in a century. The first government to notice wasn't a superpower. It was a small coastal nation nearby. Diplomatic cables, later summarized in leaked briefings, describe confusion rather than alarm. No treaty covered what New Meridian claimed to be. Wide shot of a nation's Coast Guard vessel patrolling near, but not entering, New Meridian's waters. The first satellite images leaked to a financial news outlet, not a government agency. Analysts speculated it was a luxury resort, then a data center, then a doomsday shelter. Nobody guessed the truth until an anonymous filing surfaced in a small maritime registry. It listed New Meridian's legal status in one word: sovereign. The filing exploited a real, if obscure, legal mechanism. A small island nation, in exchange for a reported annual payment, agreed to flag New Meridian as a semi-autonomous protectorate. It is the same loophole cargo ships have used for decades to avoid labor and safety law. No one had ever used it to flag an entire city. Security arrived before residents did. A private maritime security contractor, composite named Trident Protective Group, was hired to patrol the waters. Its guards carry weapons but answer to no navy, no police force, no elected official. They answer only to the founder's circle. A leaked clause in Trident's contract authorizes proportional force to protect sovereign assets. No international body reviewed that clause. No court can challenge it. In effect, New Meridian had built an army before it had a single civilian resident. The order of operations told its own story. With the legal shield in place, New Meridian began selling its future to a select few. Residency contracts were pitched not as real estate, but as citizenship. Only individuals with a minimum net worth threshold, reportedly $50 million, were invited to apply. For the first time, sovereignty itself had a price tag. Applicants were screened more rigorously than most immigration systems on Earth. Financial background checks, reputation audits, interviews with a private admissions board. Of the first 1,000 applications, composite accounts suggest fewer than 60 were accepted. 3 years after the first column touched water, New Meridian held its founding ceremony. No reporters, no heads of state, no public announcement. Just 6 people, a private toast, and a document establishing a government. The most consequential nation-building event of the decade happened in total secrecy. The charter was signed, sealed, and quietly filed in 3 separate jurisdictions. No single government holds a complete copy. By design, no single court could ever compel its release. New Meridian had become functionally unsuable. The first 60 residents arrived by private ferry on a Tuesday morning. No customs stamp, no passport control, only a biometric wristband and a signature. For the first time, someone woke up in a country that answered to no flag but its own. New Meridian was no longer a plan. It was inhabited. The nearest coastal government finally responded, not with recognition, but with alarm. A formal statement called New Meridian a legal fiction with no basis in international law. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, demanding answers about the floating billionaires. For the first time, a warship changed course toward the platform. Inside New Meridian, the approaching warship registered instantly. Composite accounts describe the security team moving to a heightened alert posture within minutes. The founder circle was briefed by video within the hour. For the first time, the city built to escape nation-states had to decide how to face one. New Meridian's legal team responded within hours, not with silence, but with paperwork. An emergency filing invoked the flagging agreement with its sponsoring island nation. If the claim held, approaching New Meridian's waters would be an act against a sovereign state. It was a legal argument nobody had ever been forced to test in open water. The warship held its position. It did not cross the line. Whether from legal caution or simple uncertainty, nobody fired a shot, nobody boarded a vessel. On the platform itself, life continued as if nothing had happened. $100 billion of ambiguity had just survived its first real test. Legal scholars called it unprecedented. Governments called it a threat. But somewhere quietly, at least 3 other consortiums began studying New Meridian's charter. If one floating nation could survive contact with a warship, others believed they could too. The idea that had taken 50 years to attempt had in one night become a blueprint. Within days, the cable describing the standoff had circulated to 4 other foreign ministries. Each began quietly mapping which of their own waters could host something similar, not to stop the next floating nation, but to be the one who profited from flagging it. New Meridian hadn't just built a city, it had accidentally started a market. That night, for the first time, New Meridian raised a flag. Not a nation's flag, its own. $100 billion, 3 years, and 1 standoff later. It had survived its founding week. But surviving a warship was the easy part. The next battle would be fought in courtrooms, not open water. $100 billion doesn't buy a building. It buys physics. Every ton of steel had to fight buoyancy, corrosion, and the open Pacific. The engineers solved it in 3 years. The lawyers, however, needed much longer. Because a floating city isn't just an engineering problem. It's a legal war that started years before the first brick was laid. And the people fighting it were never in uniform. They wore suits, carried briefcases, and never lost a filing deadline. Structurally, New Meridian is not one object, it's 412. Independent modular pontoons, bolted and cabled together, each able to flex without breaking the hull. It survives storms the way a forest survives wind, by bending, not resisting. But the real innovation wasn't in the steel, it was in the paperwork underneath it. The entire legal foundation rests on a 60-year-old treaty most people have never read. The law of the sea defines exactly how far a nation's authority reaches and where it stops. New Meridian's lawyers didn't break that treaty. They read it more carefully than any government ever had. And then, 18 months into construction, something the Founders Circle never intended became public. A single internal memo, 6 pages, 1 page for each investor. It surfaced on a financial industry message board before anyone could pull it down. For the first time, the world could see exactly who was paying for a private country. Forensic document analysis, later confirmed by 3 independent outlets, matched the memo's formatting to New Meridian's own legal templates. It wasn't fabricated, it was real. And it named 6 composite entities, matching the number long rumored to control the project. The Founders Circle finally had faces, even if the faces were still shell corporations. Each of the 6 investors funneled capital through a chain of holding companies before it ever touched New Meridian. Composite tracing suggests the money passed through at least 4 jurisdictions known for minimal disclosure requirements. None of it was necessarily illegal. It was simply engineered to be untraceable, the same way the platform itself was engineered to be ungovernable. Independence from nations meant independence from their infrastructure too. New Meridian generates its own power from solar arrays covering 9 acres of deck space. It desalinates seawater on site, producing more fresh water than its residents currently need. The platform isn't just legally self-sufficient, it's physically self-sufficient too. A private undersea cable connects New Meridian directly to global financial networks. It bypasses every national telecom system along the way. Data and money can move in and out without touching a single regulator's servers. For a project built to escape jurisdiction, connectivity was never going to be the compromise. The philosophy underneath New Meridian has a name: seasteading. The idea that permanent ocean settlements could operate free from any nation's laws. Every previous attempt failed for lack of money and engineering. New Meridian solved both, and in doing so, proved the theory could work. Political theorists have a term for what the Founders Circle is attempting: dynamic geography. The idea that geography itself, not just wealth, could become something the powerful simply relocate. Supporters call it the ultimate expression of freedom of movement. Critics call it something else: the final secession of the wealthy from the rest of humanity. The nearest coastal government finally attempted a legislative response. A draft bill sought to classify any structure over a certain size within 500 miles as taxable territory. It never passed. Legal scholars called it unenforceable outside the country's own waters. New Meridian's lawyers reportedly celebrated the failed vote with a single toast. New Meridian was no longer alone. Composite reports place at least 3 copycat projects under active construction within a year of the leak. One, backed by a rival group of investors, borrowed New Meridian's legal structure almost line for line. A market for sovereignty had officially opened, and everyone wanted a seat. An entire secondary industry sprang up around the phenomenon: security contractors, offshore insurers, legal consultancies specializing in post-national structures. Some firms reportedly quadrupled their revenue advising on floating sovereignty within 18 months. The business of helping the ultra-wealthy leave the world behind had become, ironically, one of the world's fastest-growing industries. Alongside its own laws, New Meridian introduced its own money. Meridian credits, pegged, according to internal documents, to a basket of major currencies and gold. Every transaction on the platform, from rent to coffee, runs through this private currency. No central bank oversees it. No inflation report is ever published for the public to see. Regulators outside the platform have tried and repeatedly failed to fully trace Meridian credit flows. The currency's ledger is private, maintained entirely by New Meridian's own financial authority. For a global financial system built on transparency requirements, it is effectively a black box. One regulator, speaking on condition of anonymity, called it a tax haven that also happens to float. New residents are introduced to something the charter calls the Social Contribution Index, a private algorithmic score based on financial investment, community participation, and reputation. The higher the score, the more of the platform residents are permitted to access. Composite interviews with early residents describe it, more simply, as a social credit system for the wealthy. Even inside a city built on the promise of total freedom, hierarchy quietly reasserted itself. Certain terraces, restaurants, and even medical facilities are gated behind index thresholds. A resident's $40 million can buy entry to New Meridian. It cannot always buy entry to New Meridian's best rooms. Not everyone on New Meridian lives under the same rules. Construction and service staff, recruited mostly from nearby lower-income countries, signed contracts waiving standard labor protections. They live in separate housing, commute by ferry, and hold no residency rights on the platform they built. Composite testimony from workers describes it plainly. We built the dream, we don't get to live in it. An internal environmental assessment, never intended for public release, flagged declining marine biodiversity near the site. Warm water discharge from the platform's power systems has altered local currents. Nearby fishing communities report smaller catches since construction began. New Meridian's public materials describe the platform as carbon neutral. Its own leaked report tells a more complicated story. For the community closest to New Meridian, the floating city isn't an abstraction. It's visible every night on the horizon, $100 billion of light they will never set foot in. Composite interviews describe a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and quiet economic anxiety. One elder put it simply, "The ocean used to belong to no one. Now part of it belongs to 6 men." The issue finally reached the United Nations in the form of an unofficial side panel. Delegates debated whether existing maritime law needed updating for structures like New Meridian. No binding resolution emerged. Several delegations couldn't agree on basic terminology. The gap in the map that New Meridian had exploited remained, officially, still open. Then, 11 months after the leak, the first formal lawsuit was filed. A coastal nation's government sued the flagging island state, arguing the arrangement violated existing treaty obligations. It was the first time any court on Earth would be asked to rule on whether New Meridian legally existed at all. Both sides understood the stakes went far beyond one platform. Inside New Meridian, the response was immediate and well-rehearsed. This was, after all, the exact scenario its legal architecture had been designed to survive. The Founders Circle joined strategy calls personally for the first time since the founding ceremony. Whatever else happened, they weren't going to lose the war of paperwork. The first hearing opened to a packed courtroom on one side of the world. And on the other, New Meridian's residents went about their morning as if nothing at all was at stake. One government official called it a fight for the future of national sovereignty itself. For New Meridian, it was simply Tuesday. Expert testimony opened with a simple, devastating question. Does the law of the sea even contemplate a structure like this? The professor's answer, after a long pause, not explicitly, and that may be exactly the point. The entire courtroom went quiet as the judge reviewed the documents. Silence, in this case, favored New Meridian. The flagging arrangement itself came under direct scrutiny. Cross-examination revealed the island nation received an annual payment reportedly exceeding $40 million. The plaintiff's lawyer called it a sovereignty rental agreement dressed up as a treaty. The ambassador's only defense, it was technically legal. Financial markets began reacting to the case in real time. Analysts coined a new term for the uncertainty, sovereignty risk. Every rival floating city project watched the verdict odds shift by the hour. For the first time, a courtroom decision on one platform could move the value of several others. After 6 weeks of testimony, the court reached its ruling. It would not decide whether New Meridian's charter was valid. It ruled only on the narrower question, whether the flagging island nation had breached prior treaty obligations to its neighbors. It was, deliberately or not, a verdict that changed nothing and everything at once. The court ruled narrowly for the plaintiff nation. The flagging arrangement had procedural flaws. It ordered the island nation to renegotiate the treaty terms. It said nothing at all about New Meridian's right to exist. The platform's lawyers walked out and, within a week, filed a new flagging agreement with a different nation entirely. The loophole, it turned out, was never about one specific island nation. It was about the loophole itself and there were dozens of small nations willing to fill the role. Within a week, New Meridian had a new sponsor and an identical legal shield. The lawsuit that was supposed to end it had barely slowed it down. Governments finally understood what New Meridian's engineers had known from the start. You cannot sue a loophole out of existence. You can only close it together. A coalition of coastal nations announced for the first time a joint legal working group. Its stated goal, closing the exact gap in maritime law that had made New Meridian possible. Internal coalition estimates gave the working group 18 months to draft binding new maritime rules. New Meridian's leadership treated the timeline as a countdown, not a formality. Security was quietly reinforced. Legal reserves were quietly expanded. Whatever came next, the platform intended to be ready for it. For the first time, New Meridian's rivals stopped competing and started coordinating. If the coalition succeeded in closing the loophole, every floating project would fall at once. A shared legal defense fund was quietly proposed between three competing consortiums. The billionaires who built empires by outmaneuvering each other now needed to survive together. For the first time since the founding ceremony, the founder circle didn't toast to victory. The legal war they had won in a courtroom was about to become something larger, a war over the rules themselves. 18 nations working in coordination versus $100 billion and 6 people. The engineering was finished. The real fight had only just begun. At 2:14 a.m., New Meridian went into full lockdown for the first time in its history. No public explanation, no countdown, just sealed corridors and silence. Inside the paradise built to escape every government on Earth, something had gone wrong. And nobody outside the platform was allowed to know what. Composite accounts from residents described 2 hours of total information blackout. Phones worked, calls to the mainland did not connect. Some residents later said it was the first time they understood exactly how contained their freedom really was. New Meridian didn't just control the ocean around it, it controlled the signal. The official incident report, later summarized in a leaked internal briefing, described a contained structural anomaly. Composite testimony from staff describes something closer to a near-catastrophic ballast failure in one module. One worker was injured. The platform's private medical bay treated him without ever contacting an outside hospital. No government agency was ever notified. Under New Meridian's charter, none had to be. By dawn, the lockdown was over. The message was 4 words long. No investigation was announced. No resident was permitted to discuss it publicly under their residency agreement. Life resumed exactly where it had paused. But for the first time, some residents began quietly asking what else the charter allowed the founders to hide. Every resident before arriving signs a confidentiality clause covering internal operations. Violating it isn't just a lawsuit, it's expulsion, with no right of appeal. New Meridian had built the most exclusive city on Earth. It had also built one of the quietest. What happens on the platform stays on the platform. New Meridian's surveillance system is, by design, more comprehensive than any city on land. Every corridor, plaza, and private terrace is monitored around the clock. Residents are told it exists purely for their safety. Internal security manuals, leaked in fragments, describe a second purpose: behavioral compliance. The manual describes monitoring not just for crime, but for sentiment risk, dissatisfaction that could spread. Conversations in public spaces are transcribed and scored by automated systems. Residents who criticize the founders' circle too openly see their social contribution index quietly decline. Nobody is arrested for complaining. They simply lose access to the terrace they used to enjoy. One resident, speaking anonymously and at great personal risk, described the atmosphere as polite surveillance. "Nobody threatens you directly," she said. "Your score just quietly starts dropping until you understand." Weeks after that call, composite reporting indicates her residency contract was not renewed. New Meridian's official statement cited contractual non-renewal for administrative reasons. New Meridian's charter includes a private tribunal system for resolving disputes. There is no jury. There is no outside appeal. There is no public record. Verdicts are final and enforced immediately, including expulsion from the platform entirely. For all its promises of freedom, New Meridian's justice system offers none of the protections it claims to escape. Trident's presence has grown from harbor patrol to full internal policing. Composite estimates place the private security force at over 600 personnel. They carry firearms residents are not permitted to own. On a platform with no police force to answer to, Trident answers only to the Founders Circle's private directives. Beneath New Meridian's gleaming public face is a second, much larger population. Composite estimates suggest nearly 4,000 service and maintenance staff support fewer than 1,000 residents. They live in separate housing, eat in separate halls, and carry differently coded identification. The floating utopia runs on a workforce it was never designed to include as citizens. Even healthcare on New Meridian is tiered by social contribution index. Higher index residents access a private clinic with same-day specialist care. Workers and lower index residents share a smaller facility, reportedly understaffed during peak hours. New Meridian's promotional material never mentions the difference. Its internal staffing memos do. Resident town halls exist on paper to give the community a voice. In practice, composite accounts describe questions filtered and pre-approved before the meeting begins. Live, unscripted questions are rarely, if ever, permitted. One resident described it as democracy with the microphone unplugged. By the second year, quiet resident dissent had begun to organize. Small gatherings, informal at first, began compiling shared concerns about surveillance and the tribunal system. None of it was illegal. All of it was still done carefully and quietly. In a city built to escape government control, residents were relearning an old habit, watching for the watchers. An anonymous letter, addressed directly to security leadership, listed the grievances in detail. It asked simply for an independent resident ombudsman with real authority. The response came within 48 hours. Not an ombudsman, but a review of the contribution index formula. Nobody involved believed the review would change anything. 12 months into their 18-month timeline, the coalition finished its draft treaty early. It proposed binding rules requiring any artificial ocean structure over a certain size to register with a recognized nation. For the first time, the loophole New Meridian relied on had a closing date. Structures that refused could be treated under international law as unflagged vessels, subject to boarding by any signatory navy. The phrase "subject to boarding" triggered immediate alarm inside New Meridian's leadership. For the first time, the treaty raised a possibility the charter had never fully accounted for: direct physical confrontation. Legal counsel began exploring which nations might refuse to sign the treaty at all. Security Council began exploring something else entirely. Trident proposed what internal documents called layered perimeter defense. Unmanned patrol vessels, extended sensor nets, a faster response protocol for approaching ships. It stopped short on paper of offensive weaponry. Critics who later reviewed the leaked proposal called that distinction a technicality. Coalition navies noticed the new defenses almost immediately. One admiral, in a leaked internal briefing, warned that a private entity is now hardening a position we may be legally required to board. 2 additional vessels were quietly repositioned to the region as a precaution. Markets reacted before diplomats finished a single formal signing ceremony. Composite reporting placed the estimated value of rival floating city projects down by nearly a third within a month. Investors who once saw sovereignty as the ultimate luxury asset began quietly asking for exit clauses. New Meridian's own valuation held, for now, on the strength of its head start. For residents, the treaty news landed differently than it did for investors. Composite interviews describe a mounting, quiet anxiety, not about money, but about home. Children who had grown up knowing no other address began asking questions their parents couldn't answer. The utopia built to escape uncertainty had, for the first time, become uncertain itself. Composite accounts describe the first open disagreement within the founders' circle. One faction argued for quiet negotiation, accepting limited regulation to preserve the project long-term. Another argued for open defiance, betting that no coalition navy would risk an international incident over a civilian platform. No consensus was reached. Both strategies moved forward simultaneously, in secret, from different offices. One faction's strategy surfaced first: a back-channel meeting in a neutral country. New Meridian representatives proposed a compromise: limited registration with a friendly nation, preserving internal governance. Coalition officials, exhausted after months of legal battles, appeared willing to consider it. It was the closest the two sides had come to any agreement since the standoff 2 years earlier. Not everyone inside New Meridian supported the compromise. A security-aligned faction viewed any registration as the beginning of the platform's end. Composite reporting suggests this faction quietly explored alternative alliances, including with a government openly hostile to the coalition. For the first time, New Meridian's own leadership was no longer speaking with one voice. Coalition intelligence services intercepted evidence of the rival faction's outreach within weeks. The implication alarmed officials far more than the treaty negotiations ever had. If New Meridian's security apparatus was courting a hostile foreign patron, this was no longer a legal dispute. It was potentially a national security one. A contingency plan, reportedly named Operation Clearwater, placed several naval vessels on standby. Officially, it was described as a routine readiness exercise. Nobody who saw the ship movements believed that description for a moment. New Meridian's own monitoring systems tracked the naval buildup within hours. It was, by a wide margin, the largest coalition presence the platform's waters had ever recorded. Trident's leadership requested emergency use of force authorization, a request the charter had never before triggered. The Founders Circle now had to decide in real time whether to answer force with force. For the first time, residents could see the tension with their own eyes. Few found the wording reassuring. A direct call was placed to coalition leadership, proposing an immediate public registration announcement. The request was simple: permission to approach for inspection under the newly proposed treaty framework. Trident personnel, caught between two conflicting instructions, hesitated at the harbor gate. The gate reopened with seconds to spare. The inspection boat entered New Meridian's harbor peacefully, the first outside vessel ever formally permitted inside. It was a resolution, but not a comfortable one. The platform had come within moments of colliding with itself. For a few tense minutes, New Meridian's own internal chain of command had nearly failed entirely. The Founders Circle understood privately that the next crisis might not resolve so quietly. The Founders Circle consolidated final authority under a single decision-maker for the first time. New Meridian had survived contact with the world outside, but it had also learned for the first time that it could not fully survive itself. Distant running lights, closer than any prior exercise, visible from the harbor railing. An internal announcement urged calm and asked residents to remain indoors as a precaution. Behind the scenes, the compromise faction made one final attempt to de-escalate. At the same moment, the rival security faction moved equipment the Founders Circle had not authorized. Two versions of New Meridian's future were being decided in the same hour, by different people, without full coordination. A coalition vessel radioed New Meridian's harbor control directly for the first time in the platform's history. Harbor control paused for 11 full seconds before responding. In that pause, every strategy of the last 2 years hung in the balance. Harbor control granted permission for a limited unarmed inspection team to approach. It was, functionally, the first voluntary acknowledgement of outside authority in New Meridian's history. The compromise faction had won the moment, but not the argument. Elsewhere on the platform, the security faction was already drafting its own response. Without full authorization from the Founders Circle, the security faction issued its own lockdown order. For a handful of seconds, nobody was entirely sure who was actually in command of New Meridian. It was the exact scenario the charter's clean org chart had never accounted for. One founder personally intervened, overriding the lockdown order before it could be enforced. The inspection concluded without incident, its findings to be reported back to the coalition. But the more consequential event never made it into any official record. In the meeting that followed, the security faction's leadership was formally removed from command. The immediate crisis had passed, the underlying one had not. None of it was illegal, all of it was still done carefully and quietly. The standoff ended without a single shot fired. But the story it told the rest of the world was louder than any warship. If $100 billion and 6 people could outmaneuver 18 nations, the entire concept of sovereignty had just been quietly rewritten. Within a year, at least 7 new floating sovereignty projects had broken ground worldwide. Composite estimates place combined new investment above $300 billion. Some borrowed New Meridian's charter word for word. Others aimed to go further. Bigger platforms, fewer restrictions, and no Founders Circle willing to compromise at all. Composite interviews with former residents reveal a complicated legacy. Of 9 known floating structures worldwide, only 2 agreed to registration. One delegate admitted privately that enforcement without a willing navy on every ocean was, in practice, symbolic. The gap in the map hadn't closed. It had simply gotten more crowded. Scholars began describing the phenomenon with a new term, digital colonialism. Not nations claiming new land, but corporations and individuals claiming new sovereignty altogether. Capital, data, and now territory, all moving beyond the reach of the governments that once held all three. The question was no longer whether this would spread, it was how far. What began as one impossible project had become a movement. 6 people had shown the world's wealthiest exactly how to leave it behind. And the rest of the world was only beginning to understand what that meant for everyone who couldn't afford to follow. Governments tried a new strategy, taxing wealth at the point of departure, not residence. Several nations proposed exit taxes targeting citizens who relocated to floating structures. Lobbying from the floating sovereignty industry, now large enough to have lobbyists, helped defeat the first attempts. The very wealth these laws targeted was now wealthy enough to fight back against them directly. Economists began tracing measurable effects back to the floating sovereignty movement. Composite data suggests billions in annual tax revenue have relocated alongside the wealth that once generated it. The consequences rarely appear as a single dramatic headline. They appear as a slightly longer wait at a hospital, a slightly smaller school budget, a slightly harder year for everyone who stayed. As criticism mounted, New Meridian invested heavily in public image. A widely publicized ocean conservation partnership funded a small marine research station on the mainland. It was, by most measures, a genuine environmental contribution. It was also, composite reporting suggests, a fraction of the original environmental impact report's estimated damage. Composite interviews with former residents reveal a complicated legacy. Some describe genuine community, safety, and innovation unmatched anywhere on land. Others describe isolation, surveillance, and a hierarchy that never truly disappeared, only relocated. Almost all of them, however they left, describe missing something about the place they can no longer fully discuss. Public debate over New Meridian has never resolved into a single verdict. Some see genuine engineering and governance innovation worth studying. Others see the physical manifestation of a wealth gap finally given its own postal code. Both sides notably agree on one thing: it is not going away. Not every application of the technology serves the ultra-wealthy. Several smaller, government-backed pilot projects have begun exploring floating housing for climate-vulnerable coastal communities. The underlying engineering, buoyant modular foundations, is the same New Meridian proved could work. The intention behind it could not be more different. One structural engineer who helped design New Meridian's foundations now consults on the public project instead. The technology was never the problem, she says. It never had a politics of its own until we gave it one. Her new platform will house 400 displaced families for a fraction of New Meridian's per-resident cost. The same idea aimed in the opposite direction. A coalition risk assessment modeled what unrestrained growth of the movement might look like by 2040. In its most likely scenario, dozens of semi-sovereign floating structures dot international waters. Maritime law, as currently written, has no coherent framework for any of them. The report's final line offered little comfort. The window to establish global norms is closing faster than governments can convene. New Meridian's leadership read the same assessment differently. If the world's governments couldn't agree on rules fast enough to stop the movement had already won. Plans quietly advanced for a second linked platform, doubling New Meridian's total capacity. The founders were no longer building a city, they were building a federation. Construction on the second platform began the same week the coalition's risk report leaked. It was, insiders say, entirely intentional. New Meridian had learned exactly one lesson from 3 years of legal warfare. Move faster than anyone can agree to stop you. The coalition treated the expansion as a serious escalation, whatever the legal technicalities. An internal assessment argued the doubling of capacity fundamentally changed the risk New Meridian posed. Naval assets were repositioned once again, this time closer and for longer. Both sides understood a second confrontation was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. New Meridian's defenses matured further, adding autonomous aerial monitoring to its perimeter. Officially, the drones were described as environmental and security monitoring tools. Functionally, they gave the platform real-time awareness of any approaching vessel miles before the harbor gate. The floating nation could no longer be surprised. It could only choose how to respond. The coalition rushed an emergency amendment through its member states within weeks. It declared that any unregistered expansion would forfeit whatever provisional legal tolerance New Meridian had enjoyed. The vote passed narrowly, several nations abstaining rather than directly confronting a project many secretly envied. For the first time, New Meridian's continued existence had an explicit legal expiration. For the first time, New Meridian's legal team had no immediate counterfiling prepared. The amendment closed the exact procedural gaps their earlier strategy had relied on. The Founders Circle faced for the first time a genuine choice rather than a maneuver. Comply, negotiate, or stand entirely alone against 18 nations with nothing left to file. By a narrow 4-2 vote, the Founders Circle chose negotiation over defiance. It was the first formal, unanimous effort decision the group had made since the founding ceremony. A request for renewed talks was transmitted to the coalition within the hour. For a project built on the idea of never asking permission, it was a difficult message to send. For the first time in New Meridian's history, its representatives sat across a public negotiating table. The image of the handshake ran on front pages worldwide within hours. One headline called it, "The Day the Floating Nation Admitted the Ocean Has Neighbors." Inside the room, the real negotiation had only just begun. The talks stretched across 11 consecutive days. Sticking points ranged from taxation to the tribunal system to the platform's private currency. Composite reporting describes at least 3 moments where negotiators believed talks had collapsed entirely. Each time, both sides returned to the table the following morning. The final unresolved clause concerned the tribunal system's authority over the platform's largest disputes. It took a single direct phone call between a founder and a head of state to break the deadlock. New Meridian agreed to allow limited external appeal for the most serious cases. It was a small concession. It was also the first crack in total internal sovereignty since the founding charter was signed. The final agreement became known as the Meridian Accords. New Meridian would register under a rotating oversight framework shared by 3 coalition nations. In exchange, it retained internal governance, its currency, and its expansion rights. It was neither surrender nor victory. It was, more precisely, the birth of an entirely new category of state. When the ink dried, legal scholars scrambled to categorize what had just happened. Some called it the birth of corporate statehood. Others called it simply the inevitable next chapter of a story that began the moment the first column touched water. Either way, the world now had its first treaty signed with an entity that wasn't, technically, a country at all. 1 year after the Accords, New Meridian stands larger, calmer, and more permanent than ever. Its flag still flies, so now does a small marker of shared oversight beside it. For residents, daily life looks almost exactly as it did before the crisis. For the rest of the world, nothing about sovereignty looks the same again. New Meridian is now taught quite literally as a case study. Political science programs debate it as either the future of governance or a cautionary tale about who gets to write that future. Neither side has convinced the other. The debate itself has become part of New Meridian's legacy. For most of the world, New Meridian remains exactly what it always was, a light on a distant horizon. Visible, undeniable, and entirely out of reach. The city was never built to include most of humanity. It was built to prove that, for a wealthy enough few, humanity's rules had become optional. The real story was never one platform, the expert says. It was the door it opened. 7 more projects are underway. More are rumored. Every one of them owes its legal strategy, its engineering, and its ambition to what happened here first. Every one of them owes its legal strategy, its engineering, and its ambition to what happened here first. In his only public interview since the founding, the man composite sources called Dorian Cross was asked one final question. "Do you think of yourself as a king?" He paused for nearly 10 full seconds, then answered, "No, kings inherit their thrones. We built ours." Whatever New Meridian is, a nation, a company, a warning, or a blueprint, it is no longer a question of if it will last. It has already outlasted lawsuits, warships, and its own internal collapse. It floats tonight exactly where it floated the night the first column touched water. Only now, the whole world knows its name. Somewhere out past every coastline, past every border on every map, $100 billion floats quietly on the open ocean. It answers to no government. It bows to no flag but its own. Would you live in a world where the CEO is also the king? Tell me in the comments, is this the future of freedom or the ultimate prison? Either way, 6 people already decided the answer for themselves. The rest of us are still watching from the shore. If a floating city was how the wealthy chose to leave the world above the water, there's another group that never planned to stay on the surface at all. Coming next, the $10 billion bunker built for a world its owners expect to end. New Meridian was built for freedom. What comes next was built for fear. $100 billion, 3 years, 6 people. One question the rest of the world still hasn't answered. Who gets to build the next country? And who gets left behind when they do? This has been New Meridian.